On this night, Bhopal didn't hear an explosion. There was no fire, no earthquake. Yet thousands of people died while sleeping. They didn't run. They didn't scream for help. Because by the time they realized something was wrong, their lungs had already stopped working. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, Bhopal was sleeping. The streets were quiet. Windows were open. Children were breathing softly beside their parents. No sirens, no warnings, no idea that this would be the last normal breath over 500,000 people would ever take. At exactly 12:40 a.m., something invisible began to move. Not like smoke, not like fire. This was different. This was poison. On the outskirts of Bhopal stood a chemical plant owned by Union Carbide India Limited. Officially, it was a pesticide factory. Unofficially, it was a ticking bomb. Inside the plant were massive storage tanks holding methyl isocyanate, MIC, a chemical so dangerous that even a single drop on human skin could be fatal. And that night, over 40 tons of it was stored in one tank, Tank E610, overfilled, poorly maintained, ignored. Safety systems existed on paper, in reality. The refrigeration unit was shut down to save money. The gas scrubber wasn't working. The flare tower was out of service. Experienced staff had been replaced with cheaper labor, profit had replaced precaution, and no one outside the factory knew. Just after midnight, water somehow entered Tank E610. What followed was chemistry, not mystery. MIC reacts violently with water. The temperature inside the tank began to rise. Pressure followed. Inside the control room, gauges started behaving strangely. Workers noticed it. They reported it, but supervisors dismissed it. Because alarms had gone off before, and nothing had happened. This time something was happening, something irreversible. At 12:40 a.m., the pressure became too much. The tank vented, and Bhopal inhaled. A thick white cloud poured out of the factory, hugging the ground, moving silently toward the city. There was no explosion, no fire, just death, carried by the air. The first symptom wasn't pain, it was confusion. People woke up coughing, eyes burning, throats closing, then panic. Men ran outside thinking fresh air would help, but the air outside was worse. Children screamed, then stopped. People vomited, collapsed, crawled. Some ran for minutes, some for seconds. Many never ran at all. Entire families died where they slept. By 1 a.m., Bhopal's hospitals were flooded. Doctors had no idea what the gas was, no antidote, no information from the company. Patients arrived blind, choking, foaming at the mouth. Doctors guessed, they experimented. Many patients died on the floor before they were even examined. The city was collapsing without knowing why. Inside the factory, executives hesitated. Should they inform the authorities? Should they issue warnings? Minutes passed, then hours. The siren that could have warned the city was turned off, not to cause panic. That decision alone cost thousands of lives. When the sun rose on December 3rd, Bhopal looked unreal. Bodies lay in streets, on rooftops, near wells. Animals were dead. Birds had fallen mid-flight. The city smelled of chemicals and death. Official numbers would later say 3,000 dead. The truth? More than 15,000 over time, and over 500,000 permanently injured. This was not an accident of fate. This was not destiny. This was a choice, a series of decisions where money mattered more than life, and this is only the beginning. Because the real horror of Bhopal did not end that night. It lasted decades. The night of horror had passed, but the nightmare was far from over. Bhopal was in chaos. Families searching for loved ones, streets lined with bodies, hospitals overflowing. And in boardrooms miles away, Union Carbide executives and government officials were asking a different question. How do we control the narrative? The people were dead or dying. The media was arriving, and truth had to be managed. Union Carbide's first statement was carefully worded. It was an unfortunate accident. No responsibility, no negligence, No mention of warnings ignored, just an accident. This single word, accident, was a shield that would last for decades. Media reports repeated it, governments echoed it, and slowly the world began to treat it as a tragic, isolated event. Meanwhile, in Bhopal, families were counting bodies, every life a story lost in the political spin. One of the first actions taken by the company was to withhold the chemical identity. Doctors and hospitals pleaded, "What is it? What should we treat?" Union Carbide stayed silent. Hours became days. Patients continued to die. Treatment was based on guesswork. Every hour of delay, a death sentence. This was not just negligence, this was deliberate concealment. Days after the leak, the factory underwent a cleanup. Tanks washed pipes, dismantled, chemical residues removed. By the time investigators arrived, key evidence was gone. Files, records, even lab samples disappeared. The truth, carefully erased. The gas, the negligence, the systems failure, all hidden beneath a layer of paperwork and polished floors. Workers who survived were told, "Do not speak to media." Threats of job loss, intimidation, and in some cases arrests ensured silence. Those who knew the truth kept quiet, and thus one of the most important witness groups was effectively erased. The Indian government did not act as an independent watchdog. Officials feared international criticism, loss of investment, political fallout. Instead of pressing for transparency, official reports echoed company narratives: industrial mishap, unintentional leak. Every word designed to reduce responsibility, to protect power, and to pacify outrage. Meanwhile, survivors were left waiting for help that would never come in time. Union Carbide's CEO, Warren Anderson, arrived in India soon after the disaster. He was arrested. But in less than 24 hours, he was allowed to leave the country. No trial, no accountability, no explanation. For a man whose decisions led to thousands of deaths, justice had flown out of the courtroom, quite literally at the airport. By 1989, Union Carbide agreed to a settlement, $470 million. It sounded massive, but divide that across over 500,000 victims, and the compensation per person was minimal, mere thousands of dollars per life for lifelong suffering. The company declared the case closed, the world moved on. But the people of Bhopal, their injuries, physical, emotional, and genetic, were permanent. Official death tolls, 3,000. Reality, over 15,000. Injured, 500,000. Why the difference? Because numbers shape responsibility. Lower the numbers, minimize outrage, and corporate and political systems avoid blame. Bhopal had become a spreadsheet of tragedy. Every number, a human life reduced to a statistic in a boardroom. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors treated patients without knowledge of the toxin. No protocol, no antidote, only improvisation. And government silence ensured shortage of medicines. Overcrowded hospitals, mass suffering. Bhopal citizens were left to fend for themselves, a city abandoned while paperwork and statements protected the guilty. Imagine losing your child, your spouse, your parent, watching your community die, and hearing the world call it an accident. Survivors' voices were muffled, memories were invalidated, pain was minimized for the sake of international optics. This is the human cost of bureaucracy and corporate greed. Union Carbide hid, government compromised, media filtered, victims silenced. Bhopal became a cautionary tale, not of industrial safety, but of power and impunity. Yet, despite this, the survivors continued to speak. They refused to vanish. Their suffering became a living testimony to the crimes that remained unpunished. The gas had killed thousands. The system ensured that many more would continue to suffer. And this was only the beginning of a story that would stretch across decades. The next chapters will show how the poison lived on. How children born after 1984 carried the legacy, how a city continued to pay the price for mistakes made decades ago. When the gas receded, the city looked like a ghost. Some were alive, some were breathing, some could still move. But alive didn't mean safe. Bhopal survivors were trapped between lingering poison and a system that had failed them completely. They were the witnesses, the living evidence, the legacy of a disaster no one wanted to fully acknowledge. The first hours after the gas leak were filled with confusion. People who had escaped the initial cloud were coughing uncontrollably. Their eyes were red, burning. They vomited from every corner. Many of them would later die from complications of the chemical exposure, lung damage, eye injuries, neurological disorders. Families were torn apart. Parents were too weak to carry children, children too fragile to run. A survivor recalled, "I ran out with my baby, but my mother couldn't follow. I had to leave her behind. I never saw her again." Some families lost everyone in a single night. Husbands, wives, children, grandparents, all gone before dawn. Others were fragmented. Half their relatives survived, half perished. The emotional trauma was unbearable. Many survivors reported sleepless nights, reliving every cough, every gasping breath, every scream. This was more than physical injury. It was psychological collapse. The city became a living tomb. Bhopal wasn't just suffering, it was mourning its own future. One of the most devastating legacies, children born after the disaster. These children never inhaled the gas, they never saw the factory or the chaos, yet they carried the aftermath. Genetic studies later revealed higher rates of birth defects, impaired neurological development, eye and ear malformations. Parents, themselves survivors, watched in horror as their children struggled. A mother recounted, "I survived the gas, but my baby was born with defects because of it. How is that fair?" The poison had outlived its night. It had entered the next generation. The contamination didn't stop with air. Groundwater, wells, and soil were poisoned. Hand pumps and wells were contaminated. Soil near the factory retained chemicals for decades. Crops grew with traces of toxins. Families were forced to drink poisoned water. Children played on toxic ground. Slow deaths continued silently. Scientific studies confirmed MIC and other chemicals did not degrade easily. The environment itself became a vector for ongoing disease. Bhopal was not just recovering, it was still dying. Hospitals were overwhelmed immediately after the disaster. Years later, they remained under-resourced. Free treatment promised. Limited drugs available. Long queues, poor facilities. Doctors reported, "We can treat some symptoms, but the damage is lifelong." Survivors faced chronic lung diseases, cancers, reproductive health issues, and psychological trauma. The system that failed them in 1984 continued to fail them decades later. Entire neighborhoods were changed forever. Families displaced relocation promised but not fully delivered. Neighborhoods abandoned due to toxic soil. Survivors were forced into cramped, unsafe housing or left in contaminated areas. Everyday life became a challenge. Work disrupted, children's schooling impacted, community networks broken. The city was alive, but its social fabric had been shredded. Survivors fought for justice, courtrooms, filings, endless delays. But the odds were stacked. Powerful corporations, political pressure, international law loopholes. Even when judgments were delivered, they were minimal. Compensation was delayed or mismanaged. Justice never fully reached the people who had endured the worst chemical disaster in history. Imagine the life of a survivor. Every breath a reminder of that night, every cough a warning, every child a testament to inherited suffering. Many survivors described life as living death. They weren't dead, but their freedom, their peace, their future, all taken. The grief became generational. Bhopal was not just a city, it was a chronicle of sorrow. Despite everything, Bhopal survivors demonstrated resilience, formed survivor networks, advocated for environmental cleanup, educated children about chemical safety, created memorials to remember lost loved ones. This resilience became the human story behind the tragedy. It was hope emerging from despair. but hope alone could not undo the harm. Bhopal became more than a location, it became a warning. To industries, safety cannot be ignored. To governments, public welfare cannot be compromised. To citizens, vigilance is a necessity. The city, the people, and their stories are a living record of what happens when profit outweighs humanity. When the gas began spreading through Bhopal, panic didn't arrive immediately. Confusion did. People woke up coughing, their eyes burning, their chests tightening. Many thought it was a bad dream. Others believed it was smoke or tear gas or something temporary. No one told them what it was. No one told them where to go. There was no evacuation plan. Families ran blindly into the streets, straight into the gas cloud. The poison was heavier than air, settling low, hugging the ground. Children and elderly people were hit first. Those who fell rarely got back up. Some tried to escape on bicycles, some on foot. Some carried their children until their arms gave out. But every direction led to the same invisible wall. Hospitals were overwhelmed within minutes. Doctors had no information about the gas, no antidote, no protective equipment. Patients flooded in by the thousands, gasping, vomiting, collapsing on floors. Ambulances stopped working, phones stopped ringing, the city stopped functioning. By early morning, the streets looked unreal. Bodies lay where people had fallen, near bus stops, outside homes, and alleyways. Animals died where they stood. Birds dropped from the sky. Many survivors later said the most terrifying part wasn't the pain, it was the silence. No sirens, no announcements, no help. The gas leak lasted only a few hours. The escape never came. Within days of the disaster, the narrative began to change. Officials called it an accident. Corporations called it unavoidable. The death toll was quietly reduced. Union Carbide assured the world that the situation was under control. Executives avoided direct answers. Critical data about the gas was withheld from doctors and investigators. Evidence inside the factory was cleaned, dismantled, or removed. Then came the arrests. Warren Anderson, the CEO of Union Carbide, was briefly detained and then quietly allowed to leave India. He never returned. Despite being declared a fugitive, no serious effort was made to extradite him. Survivors were left with questions and silence. Court cases dragged on for years. Compensation amounts were decided without consulting victims. Many families received sums that barely covered medical expenses, let alone lifelong suffering. Meanwhile, media attention faded. The world moved on. But in Bhopal, the disaster never ended. Survivors continued to fall sick. Children missed school. Breadwinners were gone. Entire neighborhoods sank into poverty. The cover-up didn't erase the tragedy. It buried it. Decades after the gas leak, Bhopal is still breathing its consequences. The factory may be abandoned, but the poison remains. Toxic chemicals seeped into the soil and groundwater around the plant. Wells and hand pumps, still used by residents, became sources of contamination. Families unknowingly drank poisoned water for years. Children were born with deformities. Women suffered repeated miscarriages. Cancer, respiratory disease, and neurological disorders became common. Doctors linked many of these illnesses to long-term chemical exposure, yet large-scale cleanup efforts were delayed, disputed, or ignored. The factory site became a toxic monument. Rusting tanks, chemical waste, and contaminated land left open, unguarded. For survivors, the tragedy wasn't a memory. It was daily life, every breath, every sip of water, every new child born. The poison never left Bhopal, because responsibility never arrived. Justice, like the gas, was promised, but never delivered. Legal battles stretched across decades. Corporations merged, renamed, and distanced themselves from responsibility. Union Carbide became Dow Chemical. Dow denied liability. Survivors aged, witnesses died, evidence disappeared. The accused never faced a real trial. Memorials were built, but accountability was not. Apologies were rare. Reparations were incomplete. Cleanup remained unfinished. For the world, Bhopal became a historical tragedy. For its people, it remained an open wound. The disaster exposed something bigger than a gas leak. It revealed how easily lives can be sacrificed when profit outweighs responsibility, how justice can be delayed until it becomes meaningless, and how silence can be more deadly than poison. Bhopal didn't just suffocate that night in 1984, it continues to suffocate under forgotten promises. And the question still remains, if no one is punished, did justice ever exist at all? This story doesn't end with a verdict, it ends with a question. If thousands can die without accountability, if corporations can walk away untouched, if survivors are forced to live with poison instead of justice, then what does justice even mean? Bhopal was not just a tragedy, it was a warning about silence, a warning about power without responsibility, a warning about what happens when profit matters more than human life. The gas cloud disappeared by morning, but its shadow never left. Because some disasters don't end, they drift through generations. This is drift, and some stories refuse to fade.